Can you believe that for centuries, the most powerful men in the land, the very kings and warlords who decided the fate of nations, went to sleep every single night in a room designed like a giant, highly flammable tinderbox? This isn't just history. This is a catastrophe no one saw coming, repeated every sundown across the jagged, terrifying landscapes of ancient Britain.
Forget your castles and your stone fortresses. Back in the terrifying, smoke-filled epoch of 600 CE, the Heorot. Imagine walking into a space so cavernous, the shadow swallowed sound, yet so crowded, you could feel the hot, anxious breath of the warrior next to you.
This was not just their dining room. It was their parliament, their armory, their hospital, and crucially, their bedroom. And right in the dead center of it all, radiating both necessary life and imminent death, sat the volatile heart of the structure, the roaring, uncontrolled, open hearth.
Picture the scene. The feast is over. The mead horns are empty. The glorious, terrifying sound of the scop, the storyteller, has faded into a low, anxious murmur. Outside the massive oak doors, the wolves are singing their nocturnal prayers, and the terrifying, freezing chill of the unknown forest presses like a brutal enemy against the thin timber walls.
Inside, the entire community, sometimes numbering 50, sometimes 100 souls, begins the ritual of rest. But calling it rest is a magnificent, self-deluding lie. They weren't truly sleeping. They were entering a state of armed, communal vulnerability, surrounded by the constant threat of instant annihilation, be it from raiders or from internal collapse.
The air was thick, heavy, a suffocating blanket woven from the stench of stale ale, unwashed wool, dried mud, and the acrid, eye-watering smoke that perpetually clung to the roof beams like a fatal shroud. There were no chimneys, my friends. The smoke was simply supposed to find its way out through a small, insufficient hole in the thatched roof, a massive design flaw that turned every sleep cycle into a silent, slow-burning gamble against suffocation. You are lying on a rough pallet of straw, perhaps a thick mattress of bracken if you are truly lucky and favored by the Lord, your heavy shield resting precariously next to your head, your precious iron sword with immediate, necessary reach. You are lying on a rough pallet of straw, perhaps a thick mattress of bracken if you are truly lucky and favored by the Lord, your heavy shield resting precariously next to your head, your precious iron sword with immediate, necessary reach. You are literally spooning the man who might have insulted your lineage just hours earlier during the mead-fueled boasts, because warmth required proximity and survival demanded unity, however temporary and grudging.
But the most dangerous entity in that room wasn't the jealous rival or the potential midnight raiding party battering the door. It was the fire itself. The hearth, the fire, was simultaneously the god they worshipped for keeping the darkness at bay, and the monster they feared for its insatiable appetite for wood and flesh. It was their only light source,
a flickering, unreliable eye in the absolute, light-devouring darkness that dominated the world outside their tiny island of warmth. This wasn't a modern, controlled fireplace. This was a massive pit dug directly into the earthen floor, filled with enormous, slow-burning logs that had to be tended, nursed, and watched religiously every agonizing hour of the night. Because if that crucial fire died, the cold would seep in like a poison, stealing the heat from their bodies, and the next morning, half the hall might wake up stiff, hypothermic, and tragically dead. But if that same fire lived too enthusiastically, if a single malicious spark jumped the dangerous lip of the pit and landed on the dry, oiled roof thatch just 12 feet above their heads, the inescapable nightmare began instantly. We are talking about a structure built entirely of highly resinous timber, saturated over decades with animal fat, grease, and smoke. It was not a building. It was a perfect fuse, waiting for a match.
Can you fathom the primal terror of waking up not to the sound of a battle horn, but to the horrific, frantic crackle of flame directly above you, the knowledge dawning instantly that you are trapped in a giant wooden oven? There were no fire alarms. There were absolutely no emergency exits designed for mass evacuation. There was only the frantic, blind scramble of 100 panicked people trying desperately to find the single, often blocked, main door.
And this terrifying scenario was the nightly reality for every Saxon king, every ealdman, every humble churl. They knew the fundamental statistics of their existence. The Great Hall was not meant to last forever. Its functional lifespan was measured not in centuries of glorious feasting, but in how many cold, close nights passed before the inescapable, ultimate catastrophe finally struck.
We are going deep into the architecture of dread, the sociology of shared, suffocating fear, and the brutal vulnerability of the Anglo-Saxon elite, who, despite their status, were just as exposed to the flames as the lowest thrall. We are going to explore the forgotten heroes, the fire watchers, the fear-weared, who held the thin, fragile membrane between the community and total, fiery incineration. They slept with one eye open, listening intently to the logs hiss and spit, praying that the wind wouldn't violently shift and send a torrent of blinding, choking smoke down into the sleeping mass, asphyxiating them before the flames even had a chance to lick the roof. This hall was the pinnacle of their civilization, the glorious expression of their power, and simultaneously, the perfect mechanism for their sudden, violent end. Get ready, because we are stepping back into the absolute darkness of 600 CE, where the smallest comfort held the biggest, deadliest threat, and where survival was a nightly, fiery miracle earned through vigilance. This is the true story of how they slept and why they rarely slept soundly.
The sheer, magnified scale of the danger is what modern minds struggle to fully grasp. We talk about risk assessment in abstract terms. They lived risk assessment, every waking and sleeping moment. Every single decision, from where to pile the sleeping straw to who got the coveted spot furthest from the inevitable draft, was a life or death calculus based on the fickle, unpredictable temper of wood and open flame.
Think about the rigid hierarchy within this massive, smoke-filled dormitory. The king, or the powerful lord, slept on the raised dais at one end, theoretically safer, theoretically warmer, often surrounded by his personal guard, his trusted thanes. But even his elevated position was fraught with unique peril. If the hall went up, the dais simply became the flaming stage for the Lord's final, inescapable performance.
The common warriors, the dependents, the unfortunate thralls, they were packed tightly in along the walls, closer to the main exits perhaps, but also agonizingly closer to the biting cold, and crucially, closer to the structural timber which acted as the chimney. They were destined to be the fire's first, quick course. This constant vulnerability was not a mistake of engineering. It was the accepted, unavoidable price of belonging to a tribe in an age of unimaginable savagery, where safety was only guaranteed by the size of your group and the ferocity of your defense. We look at the beautiful artifacts, the gold buckles, the intricate weapons, but we forget the terrifying environment they were retrieved from. A massive, flammable communal coffin where celebration and sudden, brutal death shared the same suffocating, volatile air.
This story is about the deep psychology of fear, the architecture of desperate survival, and the dark secret hidden within every mighty hall of the heptarchy. Prepare yourselves for the heat, my friends. The age of the wooden kings is about to ignite, and the flames spare no one.
The air still crackles with the residual heat of the last feast, but now the real terror begins. When the mead horn is empty and the skalds have finally fallen silent, the great timbered heart of the hall begins to tick like a bomb. It is not the noise of snoring warriors you should fear. It is the absolute silence, broken only by the sinister hiss of glowing embers.
These weren't flimsy structures built for quick shelter. These were monuments, the literal spines of kingdoms. The Anglo-Saxons used massive timbers, often green oak, which when cured and dried over years of use, turned the cellular structure itself brittle and thirsty for oxygen, becoming the perfect fuel. Imagine walls of pure, concentrated, seasoned fire food, stacked 15 feet high, held together by interlocking joints and iron nails hammered deep into the heartwood. This was not just wood. This was the stored memory of the forest, dried and prepared for combustion. And right in the dead center, the terrifying star of our show, the fire stove, the fireplace. It was the geographic and spiritual epicenter of the hall, yet it represented the ultimate, untamed threat.
This hearth was usually a simple, dug-out depression in the earth floor, lined sometimes with rough stones, but often just bare clay, baked red-hot by generations of continuous inferno. This pit was the sole engine of civilization, providing heat, light, and the ability to slow roast the massive joints of meat that sustained the king's elite warband during the brutal northern winters.
But look closer, beneath the glowing, shifting logs. The hearth wasn't contained by a modern chimney. It was open, vast, unfiltered. Smoke, thick and pungent, was supposed to escape through a simple vent, a mere hole in the apex of the heavily thatched roof, the notorious smoke hole. This was a design flaw so inherently catastrophic that it fundamentally defined an entire era of architecture and its accompanying paranoia.
Think about the geometry of disaster. You have an open flame, generating temperatures hot enough to cook bone, rising directly towards a ceiling constructed entirely of the most flammable materials known to man. That ceiling was not slate or tile. It was thatch. Miles of dried reed, straw, or heather, piled sometimes 3 feet deep. This insulating material, which kept the brutal North Sea weather out, was simultaneously the perfect aerial accelerant, constantly being baked dry by the heat rising directly beneath it. It became lighter, finer, and easier to ignite with the faintest wisp of flame or a single rogue floating ember. Every night was a lottery where the prize was waking up and the forfeit was instant incineration.
And the human element. The hall might house 50 to 100 people simultaneously. The king, his queen, the high-status thanes, noblemen, and dozens of warriors and servants, all packed into this single, enormous room. They didn't have private chambers. They slept where they ate, where they governed, and crucially, they slept within arm's reach of the perpetual fire.
They slept on low wooden benches that lined the long walls, their bodies wrapped in thick woolen cloaks and hides. They were nestled into their own highly flammable environment. The floor itself was rarely bare earth. It was covered in layers of strewn, rushes, straw, and sometimes aromatic herbs, which, while masking the smells of unwashed bodies and spilled ale, also acted as a secondary, highly dangerous layer of kindling.
The fire didn't need to climb the massive walls to kill. It could simply race across the floor, consuming the sleeping figures instantly, leaving no time for a scream, let alone an organized evacuation. The margin for error was less than a minute. The only slender barrier between this sleeping human powder keg and instant oblivion was the night watch, the designated hearth guard, tasked with tending the fire stove throughout the long, frozen hours. His job was impossibly simple. Keep the fire alive, but keep it contained. A terrifying, adrenaline-soaked tightrope walk that demanded absolute vigilance.
As the massive logs shifted and settled into coals, they would sometimes fracture or explode with a sharp, violent pop, sending a tiny, incandescent missile spiraling upwards toward the smoke hole, or worse, directly into the straw bedding only feet away from a sleeping noble. A spark the size of a pinhead landing on dry rush matting could take hold in less than 30 seconds, creating a lick of flame that grew exponentially in the oxygen-rich, timbered environment. Every person in that hall understood the catastrophic calculus of survival. If the fire took hold, escape was nearly impossible. The single, heavily reinforced door at either end of the structure, designed to keep Viking raiders out, now became a terrifying bottleneck, a panic point where dozens of terrified, half-asleep humans would claw their way through the narrow opening toward the freezing safety of the darkness outside.
They were literally trapped inside the most valuable and most vulnerable structure in the entire kingdom. Their wealth was their trap. The heat of the fire was the warmth of security, but also the terrifying promise of cremation. This was the ultimate psychological burden, the heavy, invisible weight of the fear tax that every warrior and every king carried into their deep, desperate sleep. They didn't just fear the enemy on the battlefield. Their deepest, most primal fear was the traitor within their own walls, the uncontrolled, sudden blaze that turned the symbol of their absolute power into their immediate, communal grave. We are about to witness what happens when that fear becomes reality, when the hearth demands its tribute in blood and timber, and the king himself must face the ultimate betrayal of fire. The night was a velvet shroud, deep, silent, and heavy with the smell of stale ale and wood smoke, a false peace that always precedes the ultimate catastrophe. The air in the great hall, thick with the exhalations of 100 sleeping warriors, was warm, almost oppressively so, thanks to the massive, glowing heart of the structure, the hearth itself. This wasn't just a fire pit. It was a hungry, breathing beast, and tonight it was finally ready to feast. A tiny, insignificant failure, perhaps a log shifted by the slight tremor of a sleeping dog, or a warrior's cloak nudged too close to the perimeter of the stone curb, was all it took. A single, malicious ember, the size of a raven's eye, detached itself from the glowing coals, rolling silently across the swept floor, a silent assassin seeking its target. It found it instantly, a drift of ancient, oil-soaked rushes that hadn't been replaced in weeks, the very bedding that lined the earthen floor. The flame didn't hesitate. It didn't lick or whisper. It snapped into existence, a vertical blade of orange light slashing the deep darkness. In those first 3 seconds, the fire was small enough to extinguish with a cup of ale. But the sleepers were too deep in the mead-induced slumber of the warrior class. The initial sound wasn't the roar of the blaze, but the horrifying, wet crackle of dried rushes turning instantly to ash. Then came the first alarm, not a shout, but a thick, guttural cough from the warrior closest to the hearth,
choking on the acrid chemical smoke of burning fat and timber. That cough was the starting gun for the apocalypse. The design of the Anglo-Saxon long hall, a masterpiece of defensive warmth and social bonding, instantly became its death trap. These halls were built like inverted ships, their massive oak posts driven deep into the earth, their walls formed of tightly woven wattle and daub, essentially dried mud and sticks, which, when ignited, acts like a chimney liner, guaranteeing vertical acceleration of the blaze.
Above them, the crowning glory, the massive, insulating roof of tightly packed reeds and straw, the thickest, driest, most flammable material in the entire kingdom. Once the flames touched that thatch, the game was over. The countdown to collapse measured in mere minutes.
The draft created by the central smoke hole, usually a necessary escape route for the perpetual smoke, now acted as a supercharger, sucking the flames upwards with terrifying velocity. It became a bellows, transforming the slow burn into a shrieking inferno.
The hall was now awake, but awareness brought only terror. Imagine 100 men, armored in their sleep-thickened bodies, stumbling over benches and each other in pitch darkness. The flickering orange light revealing only the horrifying extent of their confinement.
The air temperature soared from chilled night to superheated furnace in under 60 seconds. Their primary instinct, escape. But the great hall, built for defense and security against external raiders, offered only 1 or 2 massive, reinforced doors at the ends. These doors, designed to withstand a siege, now became fatal bottlenecks. The mass of fleeing bodies, pushing, shoving, screaming, instantly jammed the exits. Men who had fought shoulder to shoulder against Vikings now crushed their comrades to death in a desperate, animalistic frenzy to reach the cold night air.
The real killer, before the flames even touched the skin, was the smoke. Not just wood smoke, but the poisonous cocktail released by the burning materials. Soaking rushes, dried animal hides, wool blankets, and the daub itself. Carbon monoxide, heavy and silent, began to fill the lower reaches of the hall, paralyzing muscles and clouding judgment. Warriors, trained killers, stumbled blindly, collapsing before they could even reach the crush at the doors, their lungs instantly scorched by the superheated air they desperately tried to breathe. King Ethelred, jolted upright on his raised dais, was shielded momentarily by the structure of his bedbox, but the inferno was already licking at the massive roof beams high above his head. He looked down upon a sea of chaos, illuminated by a light far brighter and more terrible than any midday sun. The fire had now reached the massive structural timbers, the very spine of the hall. The thick oak, seasoned over decades, took longer to ignite, but once it caught, it burned with a terrifying, foundational heat, deep within the grain. The sound was no longer crackling. It was a deep, ominous groaning. The
the sickening protest of thousands of pounds of heavy wood beginning to yield to extreme thermal stress. The whole structure was shifting, warping.
Ethelred knew the brutal physics of his palace. Once the main roof trusses failed, the entire immense weight of the thatch and timber superstructure would collapse inward, obliterating everything beneath it in an instant, turning the hall into a burning tomb.
The center of the destruction, ironically, was the hearth itself. The intense residual heat had turned the stones around the fire pit into lethal radiators, superheating the air and accelerating the blaze horizontally and vertically.
The hearth, the supposed giver of life and warmth, had become the ultimate weapon of mass destruction, a geological furnace unleashed in the center of human society. It was the ultimate betrayal of trust, the central element of their lives turning against them with malevolent speed.
Ethelred grabbed his battle axe, not to fight men, but to fight his home. His immediate, desperate thought wasn't about saving treasure or territory, but about the sheer, impossible height of the flames now separating him from the single, small back exit reserved for the royal family. A desperate, narrow chance at life, while his entire court burned around him. This was the moment the wooden hall ceased to be a palace and became the pyre.
The pyre was lit, but the king hadn't realized how fast the fuse would burn. The moment that single, errant cinder found purchase in the dry reed thatch lining the eaves, the air itself recoiled, not with a slow burn, but with an explosion of ancient, stored heat. The resinous timber, the massive, centuries-old oaks used for the main uprights, had been seasoning for decades, turning every beam, every plank, into hardened, perfect fuel. The air became instantly opaque, a dense, choking slurry of wood smoke and soot that ripped the oxygen right out of the lungs of the sleeping warriors. They were not woken by the roaring flames, but by the silent, invisible killer that preceded them, carbon monoxide, the gas of the gods, stealing consciousness before a single ragged scream could escape the suffocating blackness. It was the speed that defined the horror. The transition from slumber to incineration was measured in mere heartbeats. Think about the roof construction. It wasn't stone or slate built for permanence. It was bundled straw and reeds, often thickly coated in animal fat or pitch, to provide some semblance of waterproofing against the relentless British damp. That pitch, that greasy hydrocarbon seal against the brutal English rain, now served as an unparalleled accelerant. It was medieval napalm, dripping molten, superheated tar onto the unsuspecting forms below, sealing their fate faster than the actual flame could reach them. The fire wasn't just consuming the wood structure, it was vaporizing it. The sheer scale of the hall meant that once the draft caught the central hearth, now a runaway blast furnace, it created a terrifying internal wind tunnel, an unstoppable convection current,
drawing the blaze toward the upper chambers, where the most valuable treasures and the king's personal retinue slept.
The Great Smoke Hole, traditionally an essential architectural feature meant to vent the daily cooking and heating fires, now served only one terrifying purpose: to suck fresh, clean air into the inferno's base, amplifying the catastrophe tenfold, turning the floor level into a churning, cyclonic core of heat. This phenomenon, known to modern fire scientists, but utterly inexplicable to the terrified Thanes, meant that the fire was not waiting for fuel. The hall was feeding itself, gulping the night air with lethal efficiency.
King Penda, staggering through the blinding, throat-searing blackness, didn't need his eyes to know the main doors were unusable. The panic of 50 fighting men, suddenly awake and trapped, would turn that single bottleneck into a guaranteed death trap, a crush of desperate muscle, expensive chainmail, and splintering bone. Even if they fought their way to the entrance, the outer door was thick oak, likely barred shut against raiders and wolves, a heavy, unyielding lock on their tomb.
His path, the path of the survivor, was the narrow, humiliating passage he had built for cowardice or necessity. The servant's passage, hidden behind the high seat's intricately carved screen, barely wide enough for one man to shimmy through while dragging his panicked body. It was his only salvation, and the absolute, crushing shame of taking it while his most loyal followers were already dissolving into shadows must have been a psychological crucible equal to the heat of the fire itself. Imagine the heat now, not the warmth of a pleasant bonfire, but the thermal output of a high-temperature blacksmith's forge. Anyone sleeping near the thick internal walls, the very thanes sworn to protect the sovereign, were now experiencing instant, agonizing cellular dehydration. The heavy, protective wool blankets they relied on for warmth were now wicks, smoking and smoldering against their exposed skin, transferring lethal heat directly inward. Their meticulously maintained leather shields, their great, prized battle axes, and their valuable spears, stacked neatly against the uprights, began to curl and hiss as they released the last vestiges of moisture trapped within their materials. The very mead in the storage barrels, the liquid pride of the feasting hall, would start to boil and burst their wooden hoops, adding a powerful, invisible alcohol vapor to the volatile mix, a highly intoxicating fuel that guaranteed an even more ferocious terminal climax to the blaze. But the true, critical structural failure wasn't the massive, expensive main beams immediately. It was the roof supports. They were typically held in place by friction, wooden pegs, and tension, the weakest link in the entire design. As the heat scorched and baked the upper rafters, the wooden pegs softened and carbonized. The connections failed, and with a terrible, grinding groan that momentarily pierced the demonic roar of the fire, the entire roof structure began its earthward descent.
thousands of pounds of burning thatch, massive timbers and melted pitch collapsed inward onto the floor below, crushing everything beneath it. This wasn't just a fire anymore. This was the hall itself giving up its ghost, collapsing in a spectacular, lethal crown of sparks and ruin. Any flickering, desperate chance of organized escape for those still inside evaporated in that crushing final moment. The king had to move now, not in a minute, not in a heartbeat, but now, or join the ashes of his fallen dynasty. His secret escape tunnel was mere inches away, beckoning him toward the terrible, smoke-drenched dawn. This was the sound of a kingdom resetting itself in fire and sudden, irreversible smoke.
The smoke still clung to the rafters like a vengeful ghost, a heavy, acrid shroud that refused to dissipate, even under the weak gaze of the newly risen sun. Every warrior who survived the night's terror, the sudden, ravenous lick of flame from the central hearth, knew they hadn't merely dodged death. They had been granted a terrifying, temporary reprieve by the gods of timber and ash.
The true cost of their survival was now visible. The main supporting post, the very spine of the mead hall, was blackened deep into the heartwood, compromised, whispering of total structural failure. One misplaced gust, one heavy snowfall, and the entire edifice of power would simply shatter into kindling.
The king, his eyes red-rimmed, not just from smoke, but from the primal fear of incineration, surveyed the damage. He didn't look for the culprit of the specific spark. He looked for the inevitable weakness that plagued every single residence of power across the savage British Isles. It was the curse of the Great Hall itself, a monument built of pure, catastrophic risk, designed to be both the center of civilization and the perfect mechanism for mass cremation. Imagine the architecture of existential dread. These were not stone castles built for siege. They were wooden beasts raised from the forest floor, designed for speed of assembly and the sheer spectacle of size. The roof, the critical shield against the endless, damp northern weather, was often the worst offender. Layers upon layers of dried reeds, straw, and sometimes shingle, woven together and constantly saturated with the grease and soot rising from the central, ever-burning fire. This chemical cocktail created a high-octane layer of prehistoric roofing felt, waiting patiently for a single ember to ascend and ignite the ultimate pyre. They called the aperture above the hearth the louver or the smoke hole, but that term was a tragic joke. It never truly vented the smoke. It merely regulated the amount of suffering, allowing the hall to fill with a dense, choking atmosphere that preserved the wood, but actively sought to suffocate the sleeping occupants below. That pervasive smoke didn't just sting the eyes, it infused the very structure. The walls, the benches, the bedding, everything reeked of fire risk, a constant olfactory reminder of imminent doom. The wood was perpetually drying out from the inside near the hearth, creating a massive, pressurized zone of extreme tinder. The most horrific fires were the ones that started not in the flames below,
but in the silent decay above. A spark, a tiny, defiant speck of heat, would drift upward, bypass the ineffective louver, and land nestled deep within the thatch. It would smolder for hours, perhaps even until the middle watch, slowly building an inferno unseen by the sleeping mass below. The first sign of trouble wasn't fire. It was the terrifying, sudden drip of molten pitch or flaming sap hitting a warrior's face, followed instantly by a sound no one wanted to hear: the deep, structural groan of the heavy timbers beginning to fail under the weight of the ignited roof. When the roof caught, you didn't have minutes, you had seconds. The air trapped below the massive weight of the blazing thatch would superheat instantly, turning the entire hall into a blast furnace. Escape became a desperate, primal scramble towards the single, often narrow doorway, leading to mass compression and the trampling of the weak. The hall, designed to protect them from the savage cold and the enemy outside, had become the most effective and brutal trap ever devised by man. The massive weight of those roof timbers, the very symbol of the king's stability, transformed into the instrument of crushing finality. This existential vulnerability necessitated the creation of the most crucial and most terrified figure in the entire court: the fire watchman. This was not a position of honor. It was a grueling, sleepless curse. His duty was simple, yet demanded absolute perfection. Maintain the sacred flame, ensuring the king and his warriors remained warm and protected. But under no circumstance must that flame be allowed to breach the stone boundary of the hearth. He was the sole barrier between civilization and instantaneous, fiery annihilation. Failure meant not just death, but the end of the dynasty, and the man responsible would often be dragged out into the daylight, not to be executed by the sword, but to be left to the elements, a fate far worse than the smoke he failed to control. The pressure was unimaginable. The thial, or royal speaker, often took on the role of the fire's official custodian during feasts, ensuring that drunken revelers did not accidentally knock over the heavy fire dogs or kick stray embers into the bedding straw that lined the floor. It was a terrifying balancing act, maximizing warmth and minimizing disaster. The great paradox of Anglo-Saxon power was that its entire political structure rested upon the shoulders of one exhausted, nervous man, tasked with controlling a force of nature that cared nothing for thrones or lineage. The hearth was not merely a bonfire, it was the national kitchen. Massive joints of meat, dripping with render, would hang or roast constantly, coating the immediate area and the wooden support structure in layers of animal fat. And as the sun finally cleared the ridge, illuminating the scorched timbers of the king's hall, every man knew the grim truth. They would repair the damage, they would replace the blackened beams, but they could never remove the threat. They would sleep tonight, just as they slept every night, a few feet from the engine of their own destruction, their lives tethered to the eternal, terrifying heat, rising from the central, unforgiving hearth. This was not just living. This was gambling the entire future of the kingdom on a single, restless spark.
They didn't just sleep near the hearth. They were steeped in it, marinated in the metallic tang of burnt wood and the heavy, sweet scent of roasting meat fat that clung to the rafters like a death shroud. Every breath was filtered through the smoke, a constant, low-level intoxication that dulled the senses but sharpened the subconscious fear of the coming midnight explosion. Imagine the king himself, lying on his raised dais, the heat radiating off the central stone ring like the breath of a sleeping dragon, his dreams perpetually haunted by the sound of timber cracking under the thermal stress of the eternal fire.
This heat was not gentle, it was aggressive, drying out the massive timber posts, the structural backbone of the entire civilization, making them brittle, thirsty, and primed to receive the smallest, most insignificant spark. The hall was literally seasoning itself for its own destruction, a process happening every night, year after year, until the wood was so dry it could ignite with nothing more than a sudden, localized burst of extreme heat. To manage this impossible threat, a chosen few were cursed with the duty of the hearth vigil, the fire watch. These were not just sleepy guards, they were the human buffer between the entire community and annihilation. Their failure guaranteeing instant death for hundreds and the collapse of the nascent government.
Their eyes, perpetually strained by the low light and the dancing shadows, scanned the perimeter of the fire pit, looking for the infinitesimal movement, the tiny rogue ember that dared to crawl beyond its bounds, toward the straw bedding or the packed rush flooring. Their primary tool was not a sword, but the bucket of stagnant black water kept unnervingly close, a meager, humiliatingly small defense against the inferno waiting to be unleashed by a moment's inattention.
The discipline required for the hearth vigil was legendary, enforced by the terrifying understanding that if they failed, they would be the first victims, trapped by the flames they were sworn to contain, their memory forever cursed by the survivors, if any survived at all. Every shift was a silent, agonizing battle against the lure of sleep, the creeping cold of the hall's extremities contrasting violently with the scorching heat of their post.
But the true horror wasn't the floor or the immediate vicinity of the stones. It was the ceiling, the ultimate powder keg suspended just meters above their heads. Above them, resting on those massive, smoke-stained roof beams, lay the heaviest, most vulnerable component, the dense, layered thatch.
Imagine a ceiling made entirely of dry grass, cured by decades of wood smoke, and perpetually waiting for the lightest touch of flame. The gap between the rising heat plume of the hearth and the bone-dry underbelly of the thatch was the true distance between civilization and ash, a distance measured in precarious inches. If that gap was breached, if the updraft was too strong, or if a swirling gust of wind dropped a burning shard directly onto the internal surface of the roof, the entire covering would ignite, not slowly, but instantaneously, erupting like a supernova of straw and flame that rained burning debris down upon the panicked inhabitants. The architectural irony was brutally deadly. The massive, soaring height of the hall, designed specifically to impress visitors and elevate the king's status, inadvertently turned the entire structure into a perfect, colossal chimney once the fire took hold. As the flames reached the thatch roof, the resulting smoke and heat would accelerate, creating a terrifying vacuum effect. A superheated updraft that sucked oxygen into the blaze and intensified the burn exponentially, turning the timber frame into kindling in mere seconds. Within 5 minutes of the thatch catching, the temperature inside the hall would skyrocket beyond human tolerance, dissolving lungs and turning the very air itself into a suffocating, searing weapon. They wouldn't even have time to gather their weapons or organize an escape. They would be instantly overwhelmed by the thermal shockwave. The large wooden doors, their only primary egress points, would be instantly blocked by a wall of searing heat and collapsing debris, sealing their fate inside a monumental pyre, their screams instantly muffled by the roar of the consuming fire. Because the physical defenses were so thin, the Anglo-Saxons relied on a blend of intense vigilance and deep primal superstition to survive the night. Every time a new piece of seasoned oak was placed on the fire, a silent, desperate prayer was offered to the old gods, or perhaps the newer Christian deity, pleading for containment and control. The act of banking the fire at night, carefully smothering the hottest coals with a thick layer of ash to preserve them until morning, was not a chore. It was the most sacred, nerve-wracking ritual of daily survival. This banked fire, the enduring brand, was the seed of the next day's life, the guaranteed warmth and cooking capability. But if the banking was performed poorly, if too much oxygen seeped in during the deep hours of the night, that innocent seed would transform into the midnight destroyer, consuming everything in its path. This existential fragility meant that the very definition of the kingdom rested solely on the stability of the central fire. If the great hall burned, it wasn't just a loss of property. It was the treasury, the armory, the political negotiation chamber, and the king's public legitimacy instantly and irrevocably vaporized. A king whose hall was reduced to smoking rubble was a king whose power was fundamentally broken, his divine right questioned by the chaotic, unstoppable speed of the flames. The rebuilding process was not just construction. It was a desperate, financially ruinous race against rival kingdoms waiting to capitalize on the momentary, terrifying vacuum of power created by the catastrophe. The smell of the smoke was the scent of instant weakness that signaled vulnerability to the waiting world. The external threat, the lurking rival king or the jealous neighbor, was a known variable in the bloody calculus of the Dark Ages.
But the true, unseen adversary was already within the walls, an architectural ticking clock that paid no heed to lineage or battle prowess. It was the simple, terrifying reality of trapped heat and dry timber, the silent mechanics of inevitable combustion that turned shelter into a crematorium. The hall was not merely vulnerable, it was engineered for maximum destruction. Its entire structure a vast, dry sponge waiting to soak up the runaway energy of the central fire. This vulnerability was not ignorance, it was the unavoidable compromise of building an immense single-room structure in a cold, wet climate, where warmth was survival, and therefore fire was king. Every element necessary for life, the massive roof, the communal sleeping arrangements, the constant cooking, was a multiplier in the equation of disaster. This was the ultimate zero-sum game played against the physics of thermodynamics. Imagine the geometry of terror. The great hall was built using monumental interlocking timbers, massive posts sunk deep into the earth, supporting the colossal weight of the roof structure. These timbers, often ancient oak, were not just decorative. They were the fuel load for a pyre capable of erasing an entire generation. Every single beam, every crossbrace, every intricately carved corner was perfectly dried, patiently awaiting the catalytic kiss of the runaway flame. Years of constant warming had leached every drop of moisture from the high framework, leaving behind bone-dry wood primed to ignite at surprisingly low temperatures, especially when the rising heat began to concentrate. Above the sleeping throng, insulating the hall from the frigid British night, lay the roofing material, a lethal blend of straw, reeds, or thick wooden shingles, often layered with earth or sod for extra weatherproofing. This ceiling was not just porous to smoke. It was a gigantic, perpetually heated reservoir of highly flammable, carbonaceous material, constantly being preheated and dried by the rising warmth from the central hearth. The air itself, thick with the oily residue of roasting meat, fermented ale, and thousands of exhaled breaths, became a dense, volatile mixture. When the fire began its rapid ascent, licking at the soot-blackened rafters, the entire ceiling structure could ignite almost simultaneously, a terrifying phenomenon known to modern fire science as flashover, but known to the Anglo-Saxons simply as the wrath. The speed of this transition from smolder to inferno was the most horrific element. The moment the flame breached the lower rafters, the heat reflection became instantaneous and absolute. The sheer volume of smoke and superheated gas trapped beneath the peak of the roof acted like a terrifying thermal lens, driving the temperature below to impossible, lethal levels within seconds. There was no gentle burning in these halls. There was immediate, overwhelming catastrophe that gave no quarter. Men who had survived shield walls and Viking axes found themselves trapped, not by stone, but by the very air they needed to breathe, which now boiled their lungs and scorched their skin before the true flames even reached them.
The human body has physiological limits, and the hall fire found them faster than almost any other threat in the medieval world. To choke on smoke meant certain death. The carbon monoxide, tasteless and odorless, was the unseen assassin that claimed the inner circle before the heat claimed the structure.
The hearth, the essential, life-giving core of the hall, was also the executioner. It was a shallow pit lined with stones, eternally stoked, often with low-quality, volatile fuel that spat sparks like angry hornets through the darkness. Imagine sleeping 3 feet away from this beast, your head nestled against a makeshift bedroll, the air tasting perpetually of sulfur and wood smoke.
It required constant, exhausting monitoring, yet the monitor was almost always a fatigued slave or a half-drunk retainer, entrusted with preventing a kingdom-ending inferno. The inherent fatigue and human error of the keeper was therefore the greatest weakness in the entire defensive system against fire.
When the alarm sounded, a shriek of terror muffled by the roaring sound of combustion, the density of the population became a fatal trap. 60, 80, perhaps 100 souls were sleeping shoulder to shoulder on benches and the floor, all oriented toward the central heat source, meaning their only escape route was often clustered around a single, massive main doorway.
Panic wasn't a choice. It was an inevitability, a crushing, suffocating wave of desperate humanity surging toward the one narrow gap of hope. Those who fell in the frantic crush were instantly trampled and then consumed, becoming roadblocks for the survivors.
The hall became a funnel, channeling the living into a bottleneck of doom, while above, the roof began its agonizing structural collapse. The collapse was heralded by the sounds no man should ever hear, the horrifying groan of monumental oak separating from its moorings, the snap of massive purlins, and the shattering roar as the water-soaked clay or sod roof lining turned into a deadly, incandescent shower of debris. This was not a slow decay. This was the instant, total obliteration of shelter and status. The sheer mass of the falling roof, heavy with insulation and soaked with tar, was enough to instantly flatten the remaining framework, burying any who hadn't made it out under tons of burning material. The King's Hall, the symbol of absolute power, could become a smoking, indistinguishable mound of charcoal and ash in less time than it took to fight a minor skirmish. The aftermath was total devastation. There was no recovery, only ruin. The entire center of governance, the treasury, the armory, the social structure, all reduced to embers. The fire was the ultimate leveler, erasing the gap between the slave and the king in a terrifying flash of heat. And outside, beyond the inferno, the rivals were already sharpening their blades, watching the column of smoke rise against the pale dawn sky, knowing that the vacuum of power they craved had finally arrived, courtesy of a single stray spark. This was the price paid for warmth in the Dark Ages. This was the terror of sleeping too close to the god of fire, knowing the entire roof was waiting to fall and bury you in 1,000 degrees of screaming annihilation. The screaming annihilation wasn't just a possibility. It was the structural guarantee of the age. Every soul in the hall, from the king on his dais to the lowest thrall bundled in straw, slept under a colossal wooden hammer, praying the wick wouldn't catch. The fear wasn't hypothetical. It was baked into the very foundation, literally stacked high into the rafters, where dried grasses and timbers met in a deadly pact against the night. We must understand the materials they chose, because these choices weren't about safety. They were about grandeur and speed, inadvertently constructing the perfect accelerant. Imagine massive oak timbers, often greenwood or freshly cured, riddled with natural resins and cracks that served as perfect channels for heat transfer. Above that, the roof, not slate, not tile, but straw, reeds, or sometimes heavily dried heather, the ultimate thermal insulator and the single most flammable material available to the ancient world. When the fire started below, the roof didn't just burn, it instantly vaporized the moisture in the thatch, creating an explosive burst of superheated gas and flames that traveled horizontally faster than any man could react. This wasn't a chimney fire you could contain. This was the entire thermal mass of the building releasing its potential energy in one brutal, singular moment of blinding light. The structure was designed to be beautiful, yes, but fundamentally it was a massive inverted torch waiting for ignition. The Anglo-Saxons were not entirely foolish. They knew the danger. They instituted systems, pitiful, desperate attempts to placate the fire demon. The first line of defense was the hearth itself, a designated depression, usually lined with packed earth or a thick layer of clay, intended to contain the coals. But this clay was constantly cracking under the extreme thermal stress, and the floor was swept, not cleaned, meaning fine dust and highly combustible organic material perpetually drifted into these crevices, waiting for a stray ember to land just right. And then there were the watchmen, the weird, men designated to stay awake and tend the fire, ensuring it didn't jump its bounds. A vital job, but these were exhausted men, often fortified with ale, fighting the crushing weariness of the Dark Ages night. Imagine the pressure on that solitary soul, sitting by the constantly smoking pit, while the king and his entire court slumbered around him. His job was to nudge the logs, keep the heat steady, and most critically, to watch for the deadly spark. But the smallest slip, a moment of dozing off, a miscalculation of how deeply the log was smoldering, and the world could end. He wasn't just guarding the fire. He was guarding the entire social fabric of the kingdom, holding back Armageddon with a worn leather bucket and a sleepy eye. And when the wind began to howl outside, sliding through the gaps in the timber walls,
the watchman's heart would seize, because the wind was the silent, external villain that turned routine heat into instant catastrophe.
Because the hall was never perfectly sealed, it was built quickly, designed for assembly and disassembly, meaning gaps and cracks were inevitable, especially high up near the eaves where the roof met the walls.
A sudden gust of wind, a midnight storm rolling off the North Sea, could act like the bellows of a cosmic blacksmith. It would snake down through the roofline, catch a perfectly innocent, half-dead coal, and transform it.
That coal, dormant just seconds before, would bloom into a white-hot, lightweight cinder, easily lifted by the updraft and sent sailing. Where did it land? Not on the clay floor, but 20 feet up, clinging to the dry, dusty webbing of the rafters, right next to the volatile thatch.
This was the most terrifying phase. The fire didn't start with a roar. It started with a whisper and a sickening smell. It could smolder silently in the ceiling cavity for half an hour, consuming the unseen wood, building heat until the entire structure was compromised from the inside out.
The first warning sign might not be flame, but the sound of dripping, molten pitch or sap beginning to boil out of the upper timber frame, followed by that distinctive, pungent scent of burning oak that cut through the stale air. By the time the watchman woke up, alerted by the sharp smell or the crackling above his head, the fire was already everywhere he wasn't. It had conquered the structure, turning the heavy roof into a collapsing curtain of pure, unbridled destruction.
The speed of the spread was the killer. You had seconds to wake up, find your weapons, find your family, and somehow navigate the dense, sleeping bodies in pitch darkness, while the ceiling became a hellish gateway to oblivion.
Think of the logistics of escape. 100 heavily armed, panicked warriors, all trying to move through a single main door in the dark, tripping over benches, furs, and each other, while the entire world above their heads was raining down screaming embers. The armor they wore for protection in battle would become the mechanism of their demise, heating up instantly under the intense thermal radiation, transforming chainmail into 1,000-degree vice grip. There was no fighting this enemy, only fleeing it, and the architecture itself ensured that escape was nearly impossible. This fear wasn't merely about losing property. It was the psychological burden of knowing that your entire legacy, your king, your court, and your physical safety were perpetually dependent on a single, sleepy man, managing a small, contained inferno in the center of a pile of kindling. The hearth was life, and the hearth was the promise of a sudden, fiery death.